Hello, please let me see your ticket stubs for the double-edged double bill. This week, Hellraiser traces the Cenobite bloodline to Pinhead. Each week, Adam Thomas and Thomas Mariani will come to the table to discuss the randomly selected yin and yang of a double feature. Then, both will have to pick a number between 1 and 10 in order to seal their fates for the next episode. One will have two good movies, the other two bad ones. Let the chaos begin. I am Adam Thomas, and Jesus wept because he's just a little baby. Oh.
And I am Thomas Mariani, and this is The Pod. You downloaded it. We speak.
Yeah. We do. We do that.
Yes, despite all the letters we get saying, please, sir, don't. Please stop,
Don't
both
speak.
of you.
Guys, stop speaking. No, your suffering will be legendary.
Yes, for sure, yes. Welcome, everybody, to the Double-Edged Double Bill, where every week, Adam and I cover a good and a bad feature we picked at the end of the previous topic. And, we should point out, first episode of October. Every October, we like doing a full month of horror, spooky-themed episodes. Oh, isn't it great, the fall season, Adam, here and robust and ready for us to cover so much horror stuff.
Yeah. Alright.
Don't get too excited. Whoa. I gotta turn down the audio. You're blowing up the mic. Whoa.
Sorry. Ooh, barrel of excitement here.
Yes. But, it's always fun to kind of get back into the horror spirit of it all. And this time, we're doing a topic I know, Adam, you're pretty excited about, genuinely. Because we've covered Clive Barker in general on a previous October. In that episode, we somehow avoided his main claim to fame, Hellraiser, which we are devoting an episode to now. Because the week this is coming out, there's going to be a new Hellraiser that will debut on Hulu, and also it's like the 35th anniversary of the original movie coming out. So it's a lot.
It's a whole lot. Yeah, no, I've been a Clive Barker fan, obviously, since the first Hellraiser when I first saw it. And I've kind of held true that, yeah, Freddy and Jason and Michael Myers and Leatherface, they're all great. Like, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great movies in those. But as far as even as simple as something like character design, you don't beat the Cenobites. You don't beat it. You don't beat the sort of complex origin of these characters. You know, the complex origin of what the La Marchand puzzle box can do. I mean, there's just so much rich mythology there, which not necessarily has translated very well, especially in the subsequent sequels since the first one and maybe the second one. But there's just so much there to grasp and gleam onto. It's sexy, it's dirty, it's gross, it's violent, it's gory. The score, even. I mean, it's just something about Hellraiser that just really revs my engine.
Yeah, and I mean, Hellraiser was something where I was always like sort of aware of Pinhead, as he's often nicknamed, even though it's not a name that Clive Barker prefers for the character.
No, see, he's the lead Cenobite.
Right, lead Cenobite is credited in the first film, which we'll talk about in a bit. But also, I think he said the nickname he preferred was like the Hell Priest, right?
Exactly, the Hell Priest. Which, because I've read all the books, learn. In the original novella, Hellbound Heart, there's never really a name given to the character. It's just that the Pinhead character has more speaking lines than any of the other Cenobites. So it kind of became the head of the group. So lead Cenobite really is probably the most proper term for him. Pinhead, well, I mean, that's what people identify him, but when you really think about it, it's kind of stupid taking away from the character. He's got pin in his head, he's Pinhead.
Right, it was like it originally started as like a nickname that like the makeup effects crew.
Right,
and
it
then
just stuck.
And then it turned into like a derogatory nickname, I think, in the third movie. Someone like derogatory says like, "Oh, what are you looking at, Pinhead?" or whatever, and then it just stuck, I guess.
It just feels like such a stupid term. Like Hell Priest sounds kind of cool. Like that sounds dark. It sounds sinister. Lead Cenobite even works because he was the one doing most of the speaking. But Pinhead, come on, I've always hated that name.
Well, I mean, for me, with like the sort of the Hellraiser of it all in general, like I would watch the first two Hellraiser movies in high school, and I remember liking at least the first one quite a bit, as we'll talk about as we get into the show itself. And then I got turned off by some of the stuff that happens in Hellraiser 2, like near the end in particular, and then everything I'd
Yeah.
heard about like the sequels, which is like, oh, especially like, oh, it was legendary for a while, speaking like, oh, it's the franchise where there's so many direct-to-video sequels and they're all so bad and they're all so terrible, but in prep for this show, Adam, I watched all 10 of the currently released Hellraiser movies.
I own them all. I've seen them all
Right. That's how I
several
was able to
times,
do this, because
actually.
most of them are not available for streaming. Unfortunately,
Oh,
or fortunately, depending on the particular one. But honestly, watching all 10 of those movies, I can say, like, my biggest hot take is I only really heavily dislike a couple of them. I wouldn't say most of them are good, but I would also say at least, like, there's something interesting about most of them. To where I could see, like, especially even some of the direct-to-video ones, where it's like there's an interesting ambition that if this was a bigger budget, it could work, or even there's some ridiculously silly stuff. And I think particularly Hellworld is such a dumb fucking movie, but it's kind of
but
fun.
it's kind of fun. No,
It's
it's
yeah,
fun. Yeah, it's fun. No, I completely agree. I kind of like most of them as well for different reasons. I know a lot of them aren't good, but there's certain things, like you said, like if there was more of a budget behind it, like this could really work. There's one that I really dislike and one that I vehemently hate. And there's one that's just kind of like, this is lame. But for the most part, I think they're kind of fun.
yeah. I guess we'll as we go along, as we get to, if you're a regular listener, you know our usual segments near the end where we'll talk about a couple of the other movies in the franchise. But we're here to talk about specifically two movies that we picked at the end of the last episode. The good pick, which was one of your choices, Adam, which is the original Hellraiser from 1987. And
Yep.
then my bad pick, which I had as a choice, but credit to our Patreon subscribers, patreon.com/DEDBpod. They voted in a poll between my two choices, and we ended up with Hellraiser Bloodline. So interestingly, despite the fact that the series is mostly straight to video, we're talking about two of the theatrical releases. The first
Yep.
and the last theatrical release of the franchise.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
Hellraiser,
Hellraiser. Yeah, I was
yeah.
gonna say, you beat me to it.
We have our fun here. But let's start off with Hellraiser.
Beyond any terror you have imagined. A nightmare.
No.
Unlike anything you have witnessed, is born. Because within these walls, the unholy is unleashed. Hellraiser, a film by Clive Barker.
We'll tear your soul apart.
So Hellraiser came out September 10th, 1987, directed and written by Clive Barker, based on his novella, The Hellbound Heart. Him actually directing this movie was mainly because he had seen a couple other early adaptations of his work and didn't like them, so he decided to actually get behind the director's chair. Very rare for an author to actually direct a film adaptation of their work.
Incredibly rare, but also for that to be like, yeah, all right, we'll go with it then from a studio producer standpoint. Like that, it's almost unheard of.
Yeah, there's like a few examples, like a Michael Crichton, or even, of course, before this, there was the infamous Stephen King of it all.
Yeah, which we talked about all the way back in like what episode 8?
It's like 12, I think. It was a very early episode that
It's still early, and I hate it.
Adam doesn't like his earlier work. You can tell that this movie is definitely made by a first-time filmmaker. There's definitely a few like awkward bits and pieces that like feel like, okay, this isn't someone who's extremely experienced behind the camera. There is still like a fascination that makes like any of the weird choices of Barker and kind of work with the weird ethereal tone of the movie.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, yeah, it is a first-time director, but you could tell it's a first-time director who is really trying to get his vision across. I mean, some of the camera angles might be a little sloppy or a little weird. I think that's the charm of the movie.
Though at the same time, I do appreciate that, like, any interview you see with Barker talking about this movie, he is always very thankful to, like, the crew for actually, like, working with his, like, sort of ineptitude, as he would put it. Like, he's very humble about that.
100%. My favorite Clive Barker interview I've ever seen, I think it was on the special edition, like 25th anniversary Hellraiser DVD, Blu-ray, or whatever. And it's Clive Barker sitting there, and they're all in the like a room where it's dark and there's chain swinging. And Clive Barker's like, "This is the last time I ever talk about this son of a bitch movie." You're like, yeah, because like he's done with it, man. But he knows how important it is too, which is great. I mean, oh God. I love this movie. I love this man. This is going to be a lot of fanboying for me. I'll try not to.
Right, but what do you think separates him just as a director overall? Because he only directed this movie, Nightbreed, and then Lords of Illusion after this. What do you think separates his sort of like directorial style from like a lot of other horror filmmakers, in your opinion?
I don't think as a director he was great. I think he did great movies, but as a director, you could tell like he's new. The passion makes up for the lack of directing skill. Like he knows what his story is. He wrote the fucking thing. Like he wants to show you all the stuff he can possibly do to push the story.
See, that's a thing with like any sort of director writer in general, where it's like someone who has written the screenplay. But I think the additional layer of being somebody who like wrote this originally as a novella, and then putting that onto a script, and then putting his vision as much as he can through the camera lens, I think that adds a whole nother layer where, like, this movie feels so much more sort of, like, ethereal than a lot of the other sort of, like, supernatural slashers from around this time. Because it feels so much more like this is a weird, like, journey into a bizarre place, with even down to just the basic setting of this movie, which is kind of infamous for the fact that it was shot in England, and they had a lot of English actors who were doing American accents, but then New World Pictures, who financed this movie and the second movie, Roger Corman's other company, was like, oh, you know what, we really need to make sure this is very Americanized, so we're going to dub over people.
Yo, Frank.
Yeah. Frank is like the best example.
Good God, it's terrible.
It's really bad.
It's really bad.
Which even the actor, Sean Chapman, has said as much. Like, he originally had, like, he's a British actor, but had an American accent and everything prepared. And then he was just like, it's so flat and wooden, like, that voice. It doesn't fit at all with what I was trying to do with the character. But at the same time, what I like is that, like, with stuff like that, or even just the weird setting of, like, it's in England, but they never mention specifically England as, like, a setting, it does feel like it's just a weird at-a-time place. And even, like, the people who have these weird overdubbed accents, like, Frank is mostly shown either, like, in, obviously, like, his weird mutated, like, growing form or in flashbacks. It adds, like, a weird, like, ethereal thing where it's just, like, Frank is this otherworldly creature at this point. He's not a human anymore. And even his voice shows that. He's just like, he has a different timbre that's on a completely different sound wave to everybody else.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. And then you got Andrew Robinson, who's just this weird dude in the movie. Like, he's good, but he's weird. Mm-hmm. Like, just kind of the way he acts, and he's kind of cool with, like, his daughter being really sexually flirted with that other guy. And, like, it's a really weird group of people. Like, every normal person in this movie is strange. Kirsty to Uncle Frank to the dad to Julia, who is fucking great. Yeah. But everybody in this is just off. There's no normal person in this movie. Everyone's a little off kilter.
Right, which, like I've heard some people say, like, oh, that kind of turns them off of the movie. But at the same time, for me, I think that really works because you're already going to deal with, like, these weird Cenobite creatures. But I just like that even the base reality of this is, like, slightly uncanny valley, almost. Where it's just like, oh, these are, like, recognizable, like, humans. But at the same time...
Humans,
yes. Right, yes. But at the same time, they have these weird eccentricities, which is why, like, especially with this movie... It's one of those where, like, we often talk about sort of character likability and how much that can invest you in a movie. But I think this is a great example of a movie where, like, all these people are kind of assholes, but they're intriguing assholes at the same time. Like, even Kirsty is arguably the most sort of, like, innocent, and even then she immediately is just like, oh, wait, you're Frank, right? Why don't I, like, completely sell him out and have you, like, fucking bring him back or whatever? Like, she still has, like, that instinct to, like, sell somebody out at the same time. Like, these people aren't the most traditionally likable, but they're still incredibly fascinating characters.
No, 100%. Yeah, like don't be wrong. I love Kirstie Cotton. I love Ashley Lawrence. I got to meet her. She hasn't aged a day, and she was very sweet. Actually, I got to meet the whole principal cast. I'm jealous.
No, I'm sorry. Let me pick up these names that you just dropped, Adam, and bring
Yeah,
it back to
oh, really? I can keep going. Simon Bafford, Nicholas Vince,
Oh, too many names.
Clive Barker,
Come on.
Andrew
I gotta get
Robinson.
it back.
I made them all. Yeah, no, the thing about Kirstie Cotton is like it's very relatable in a way because like she cares about her dad. She's not too crazy about Julia, but she's like, oh, I'll give it a chance. Like fine. You kind of get it. She's this fish out of water girl trying to like have some kind of relationship with her father because it's probably the only family she has left. But at the same time, she's like, oh, I'm going to sell everybody up the river so I can still live. Like, yeah, you get that. That's real. That's the thing about it. It's real. Like anybody in that situation would do that for the most part. I mean, I don't know what your relationship with your family is. I know what mine is. All y'all motherfuckers are going to go meet Leviathan. But yeah, I totally get it. Like nobody in this movie is cookie cutter cut and clean. Like it's not the pure girl that you see in, the final girl sort of stereotype. It's none of that. Everybody feels like a real person, and yet it's this weird sort of quarter turn to the right or left where it's almost fantasy like.
Right, yeah, that there's a bit of like an unreality that makes it kind of like already off kilter before even the Cenobites actually come in.
But it's very subtle. Right. It's one of those things where like I did see this as a very young child, and I saw Freddy in Nightmare on Elm Street probably before this, Friday 13th. And I saw this, and this one always stuck with me. Like it scared the shit out of me, but the whole thing felt weird.
Right, because even as over the top as some of the characters could be in like Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, like those kids seemed like vaguely recognizable kids, like from like the counselors of Friday the 13th or Nancy Thompson in Nightmare on Elm Street, versus like Kirstie you haven't quite like seen before, and especially this movie's dealing with much more sort of adult subject matter with particularly like the infidelity and a lot of the sexual themes that are going on. This is like very much outside of like that even basic thing as like a kid who loves horror movies. Like, oh, there's a teenager. I'm gonna grow up and be a teenager someday, and oh, they're gonna face off against Freddy or Jason. It's like, no.
But I even remember as a kid the scene at the dinner where the whole family's around. She's like, oh, if I keep having another one of these, I'll end up on my back or whatever it is. And the guy who said there's like, so why not lay on your front or whatever it is? Like he basically tells her, I'm gonna have sex with you.
Right.
And her dad's like, oh. Like, this is weird. They all feel like people who went to an insane asylum to prove that they're not crazy.
It's the uncanny valley sort of thing. It approximates some kind of humanity here, but at the same time, like a lot of the major feelings that they have or the major sort of arcs are based on like really true feelings. Like with, you mentioned Julia, played by Claire Higgins in this movie. She clearly has this like sexual frustration with her relationship with the Larry Cotton character, and is thinking back to like, oh, that wistful affair I had right before my wedding with Frank. And the moment she sees like the idea of like, oh, Frank is actually here and he can come back, it's this like unsettling, unnerving thing to her. But it kind of dissipates when it's like, but I can also get what I want, which is me deep dick in this guy again. There's this great like mix of emotions where it's just like, even the moment something supernatural is introduced, it's like, oh, it's terrifying, but I can also get what I want out of this, right? I can get something out of this. And that's like it's a thing that can make someone in theory look unlikable, but at the same time with Julia, you get that sexual frustration. Like Larry is kind of a dork who doesn't really seem to be that
kind of. I cut my hand. Oh, I'm gonna pass out.
I love that. Yeah, which is like gets the nail, just like, oh, just look at it, I'm gonna pass out.
It's so great. But yeah, no, I mean, and that's the thing about the whole movie. I mean, and I think that's honestly, if you look into it, the backstory and sort of what they had to deal with the MPAA and all that on this movie, the whole movie is sexual. Like that's the point of the movie. It's about repressed sexualization and sort of demons that are involved with that, and I think Julia's probably the biggest example of sort of playing that on screen. But everybody in the movie has that. Like that's literally every character is going through the same thing. I think Julia's is kind of our, I don't know, looking glass into that world. The Cenobites in this one, I mean, I'd argue that as we get into later sequels, it kind of gets pushed to the front a little bit more. But inherently, they're S&M sexual creatures. That's the point. It's pleasure through pain. And I think that made a lot of people uncomfortable with this film and the franchise in general. And I mean, yeah, we ended at part 4 in theatrical, but to me that's a shame because I think people wanted the run-of-the-mill slasher that was happening around this time, and this is not that. Pinhead doesn't, at least in this one, like slash anybody's throat. It's all like this weird ethereal, crazy heaven and hell sexual tension that was not done before and hasn't been done since.
A big thing that, in terms of like sort of the slasher thing that you're talking about, this is not too long after, like we've kind of talked about this on the show, like the sort of big boom of the slasher is from like Halloween coming out in 78 to around like 1984. And then we started getting like some of these other movies that trying to experiment with like doing big stuff with the slasher that kind of tries to deviate. Like this is right after Friday the 13th Part 6, where they're trying to be a bit more meta and comedy focused, and people weren't responding as well to that. With Hellraiser, like this was a very big success when it came in, I think because it's a bit what you're talking about, where it's this more fantastical, like bizarre, fascinating idea of just like, oh, the slasher villain is from like another realm entirely, like it's coming into our world.
Well, he's straight from hell. Like that's the thing about it. Like there's no question where Pinhead and the Cenobites are from. They're from hell. Biblical hell.
I don't know. I don't know if the title really sells that, Adam. I'm not sure. What's sort of being like unearthed from where? I don't know. Like what's being like raised, as it were.
But I guess the thing about it is, like, yeah, it's from biblical hell and everything, but it's not in the way that anybody recognizes hell. Like they don't have horns, they're not big red demons with pitchforks. It's this weird sexual pleasure for pain thing, and I like, yeah, it was successful at the time, and yeah, it kept on for another 3 movies in the theaters, but then it kind of died because I don't know. I think people aren't as acceptive to this type of idea.
But yeah, I think the one where it really starts kind of like going off the deep end is like Hell on Earth, Hellraiser 3. It's in like the same era as like Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, or Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, where it's like, oh, we're going to do like big over-the-top silly things to make this fun. And that was just after like 2 previous movies that were much darker, much more sort of presented like a lot of these themes that we're talking about here. So it feels like they almost like, okay, we got Hellraiser 2 very shortly after this, and we like are kind of tired of that particular motif. Let's have fun with Hellraiser. It's like, this isn't really a fun idea. This is like fucked up and weird.
It's horrible. It's disturbing. It's dark. It's crazy. Like this movie is supposed to play with your deepest desires and like make you feel uncomfortable. That's the point. Once you put Pinhead on a city street in New York or Chicago or wherever the fuck, you've lost. Pinhead shows up in that club and makes a seedy Cenobite and a bartender Cenobite. You're done. You've completely damaged everything that the movie and the lore is supposed to be.
It was weird watching this the first time. I distinctly remember being like, wait, Pinhead isn't in this a lot. That's weird, because I'm used to like from the cultural osmosis of who Pinhead's supposed to be.
Yeah, it's like 8 minutes.
Yeah, it's like around 8 minutes of screen time, I would say. Yeah, and it's so fascinating in this movie. Like, what I love so much about this version of the characters that starts to dismantle around the end of Hellraiser 2 is that they're like the Switzerland of like the slasher villains in terms of they're just like, like we're neutral ground here. Like, someone opened the fucking box and we have to get some kind of blood. So like, we need something.
Yeah. Hey man, you open it, we came. What's up? We gotta take something back with us. So what are we doing here? What do we do here, guy?
Right. Yes, but there's like a neutrality of that's so fascinating because they don't have like specific motivation or anything in this movie. It's just like, I know, a box got open. We gotta do some shit. Like, we need some retribution. Come on, let's bring this on. And I love that in this movie where just the moment they come in, there is no like reason. There's no humanity there, despite the fact they're humanoid. These creatures are just like, yeah, we need something. You know, whether it's like you or Frank, doesn't matter. We just need some blood.
Oh no, man! Once they find out Frank escaped, and they know that Kersey knows Frank, they're all about Frank. Right. The thing about this movie, like, yeah, no, give us Frank. And then, which to me really works because it just shows how evil they really are. Because at first you get the idea like Kersey could bargain with them and they give you Frank and you let me live. They're like, all right, cool. And then they get Frank and they're like, no, we want you to. You're coming with us. And she figures out a way out of it. But no, dead ass, they were going to kill her too, take her with them, because they are pure evil. And I think that's why I sort of glommed onto it in the beginning. That's why I still love it so much, because you don't need that much explanation to these characters. They are pure evil. If you are somebody who knows about the Bible or hell or whatever, they are demons from hell. You don't need any more than that. They are evil, but they do not need a reason to do what they do.
Right, but at the same time, I do like the fact that they're not even like angry toward Kirsty or anything when they decide like, oh, it's more of just like, well, it's a 2-for-1 sale. Like, there's two.
Yeah, it's total. It's passive aggressive fucking evil. Like, I guess you're coming with us. What's up? Like, I love it. It's a job to me. Watching them, it feels like they're just doing their job.
Right,
like that's their job.
It's a bit more of like a bureaucracy thing as opposed to like a real animosity, right?
They're reading the sales script.
If you see by our chart here, it looks like our blood intake has been a bit down this quarter, so I think we got to take 2 of them here. Let's really
So I've heard you're not happy with your wireless service.
Hey, chatter, I'm gonna need those TPS reports by Monday.
What do you know about gut health?
But I mean, we went into while we're talking about the Cenobites, we might as well talk specifically about like Pinhead is played by Doug Bradley, who played Pinhead for the first 8 movies in this franchise.
A gem of a man.
Right. All the interviews, he seems like a very much a gem, nice dude.
I met him too.
You mentioned you. I'm sure that's one of the names I picked up earlier.
Yeah.
But with Bradley, like what I love about his portrayal, he even said this as much that like in while he was being directed by Barker, he kept being told like just do less, bring it down, like don't go too over the top.
And that's the beauty of it. Wouldn't like if it were you or I in that makeup, wouldn't you want to be big? Be like this big snarling demon. That's what you naturally would do.
Right, as opposed to Bradley, what very much in this movie has this like very sort of like demonic tone, but at the same time it still is very like without huge inflection, without like a lot of monstrous boisterousness. Even like the lines we talk about, he yells them, but it's not in like a boisterous, like I am a demon from hell. It's just like you open the box.
It's just loud.
Like, right. It's not with an exclamation point, but a very firm period every sentence.
We have such sights to show you. You're like, that is amazing. No, I completely agree. It's not loud, it's not boisterous, but it's authoritative.
Yes.
Like, this guy is in charge, at least of this sect, which we won't get into, but if you read the books, there's a lot of different sects of Cenobites. And these Cenobites are part of the rule of the gash, is what they are.
Right. But to get back to some of like the more human elements, like we mentioned like sort of the sexuality and all this other stuff, like right from the jump where we do get like Frank's sort of origin as he is like opens the box, gets the box, and then like is torn apart. Like you get immediately like that mixture of the pain and pleasure where he's like he wants to like go to the breaks. Like he's somebody who clearly has lived such a huge life that he's like, I can't come, quite frankly. He's like, I need something
100%.
weird.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I need something weird and adventurous and like bizarre. So I found out about this box, and apparently it's like some weird sex thing, and it's like, oh, it's way more than a weird sex thing, dude.
Way more than a weird sex thing. Frank also has a 1950s greaser switchblade, so good for him.
Right, and all of that is stuff that like fascinates Julia with I like even when we get the flashbacks of the sex scenes with her and Frank, they are much more raw than you would see in like any other like horror movie around this time. There's like any of the sexuality, even in like the sequences where she brings men from like the bar or whatever to like feed Frank his blood. There's like a bit more of like an interesting sexual tension that isn't in like so many other horror movies like that feel much more like sexless. Like literally, like there's all sorts of studies about how Jason or Leatherface are trying to like punish those who have sex versus no, the sex is like both the crime and the fascination here. So basically a lot of the sexuality, whether it's from like the side of Julia or the Cenobites with their sort of S&M imagery and stuff like that, sex is more built into this as opposed to like other horror movies that try and ward off of it from around this time.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, in Friday the 13th, Nightmare, Halloween, all that, sex was almost used as a detriment. Like, yeah, sex, you die. Like, that's it. In this movie, everybody has sex. Like, this is a very sexual fucking movie. And the thing is, even about the Frank and Julia flashbacks, which they're great, but they're the reason why the movie isn't R-rated, not NC-17.
Well, that there was a lot of like sort of the controversy about like the edits and stuff about like a lot of those sex scenes.
Yes, the amount of thrusts was too much. That's insane. Like, she's wearing a bra. You see his back. There's no nudity, but it's just implied they're having sex, and you can't do that. This movie's so inherently sexual in so many other places than that scene. Like, come on.
We haven't mentioned much, but like the sort of gory effects work here, which is phenomenal in this movie. There's so many great examples of like where the big sort of like gore explosions that happen almost feel at the same time like orgasms. With stuff like when Frank like blows apart at the end, some of these other things where like it feels like the gore is inherently tied to like a sort of sexual pent up explosion that just bursts out at the same time. It's all like really intertwined. The best thing, like one of the most incredible practical effects sequences in a movie, is Frank rising up from the wood panels.
It's amazing. Filmed in reverse.
Right.
For the most part. And it still holds up. It's still scary. That fucking scream he lets out when he's half a skeleton is terrifying. Terrifying. But it's amazing.
And at the same time, it also has a sexual imagery to it because they're like rising up in an upright stance. Like it's like basically an erection metaphor at the same time.
It's all phallic. 100%. Read any Clive Barker book. It's phallic.
Does Clive Barker have a fascination with penises? I wasn't aware.
No, he doesn't. I discovered that myself, and that's my new my thesis I'm writing. It's not approved by anybody.
Several citations are needed.
Yeah, like you said, this movie did make a lot of money, but there is a steady drop down as far as how much money they made going forward. Because honestly, out of the era it came, and maybe even nowadays, other than Clive Barker's own works like Candyman and things like that, how many just sexually charged horror movies that aren't out in the open, though? Like, it's sexually charged, but it's not constant nudity. It's not constant this. Like, but the whole movie feels sexual. It's not a horror movie thing that happens that often.
Not as much in like sort of like the mainstream horror stuff. No, I agree. It's definitely a lot more like these sort of like interesting, more underground sort of things. Or even when there is like a sexuality in a mainstream horror movie, it's more built in like a more romantic way. Like even Interview with a Vampire,
right?
Maybe like about a decade after this.
It's in your face. Where this is subtext in a weird way because it's openly sexual, but you don't realize the scenes that aren't supposed to be sexual or that you would think are sexual.
I mean, I would say it's very textual with particularly the Frank-Julia relationship. That's very, like, obviously textual.
But I'm saying even every scene where Frank's hand is cut, it's penetrated to where they're shoving the mattress up the stairs to where, I mean, it's constant sexual undertones, the whole film.
Right, I mean, and even, like, a lot of the stuff with, like, Frank having the weird fascination with Kirsty, where it's, like, even a darker side of sexuality, with the incestuous element of it, which becomes even more upsetting once Andrew Robinson takes over, which I think that's the big thing, is, like, his performance is so fascinating, where we talked about earlier, kind of a dweeb, also kind of an asshole in terms of just stuff like, oh, hey, you know, we're going up here, like, maybe someone should get us a beer. There's a pause, it's like, fine, I'll get it, I guess I'm not doing anything. Just, like, very clearly into, like, sort of more traditional roles for like men and women, and then by the time we get to him as Frank, it becomes so much more lascivious and upsetting and disturbing.
Oh, it's so gross and weird, where it almost looks like he's got spaghetti noodles on the back of his neck where he just put on the...
Okay, it's like he's trying to glue his hairline together with like fucking weird jelly on his hairline.
Oh, it's so gross.
And of course Frank's famous horror movie catchphrase being "Come to Daddy" makes it all the more upsetting when he takes on that particular version of the character.
It's so gross. But yeah, but even Andrew Robinson, where he's like he's trying to fill up Julia, and Julie has already seen the reincarnated Frank and all that. She's like, I'm just not into it. I don't know what's wrong with you. No. Right. You know? But yeah, that flip, I mean, it's such a great performance. He's so creepy and so weird. The "Come to Daddy," and just the idea that one of the most famous quotes from the film, that Jesus wept, was improv.
Right, it was initially like a fuck you, and then Andrew
Yeah.
Robinson came up with that, and Clive Barker was like, no, do that! Fuck yeah, do that, that's way better!
Because that's creepy and weird and on so many different levels offensive. And it's perfect.
Right, especially with that like stretched out version of his face and the explosion that happens and all this other stuff. It's once again leading up the whole sexual charged element of it, yeah.
Uh-huh. Oh, gross. But I did want to touch on this because obviously
Yes.
the practical effects in this movie are great. The sort of cell animated effects, not the best.
Yeah, on the lightning and stuff.
Yeah, when you find out they ran out of money and Clive Barker and the visual effects artist did that in his kitchen,
Right.
you're like, oh, okay, that's pretty great.
I mean, honestly, the only time the effects really bother me is with the character who, of the Cenobites, like, we haven't talked too much about, like, I love, like, Pinhead, Chatterer, the female Cenobite, Butterball. Those guys are great. I hate the engineer. It's such a dumb creature that looks bad and, like, moves badly.
I don't like the engineering either, but I'll raise you the sort of gargoyle demon thing at the end. I think it looks way worse.
The gargoyle thing is, like, only there for, like, a couple shots, as opposed to the engineer, they hold on the engineer. And also, the engineer is, like, the big final Cenobite that they have to fight after, like, everybody else, like, disappears into hell or whatever. He's the final one who just shows up, like, oh, I'm gonna grab at you. Like, he's much more prominent than the fucking skeleton guy is.
How much better would it be if that engineer was going, I'm going to grab at you, I gotcha.
Well, the thing is, it almost looks like the thing at the end of Evil Dead 2, like the big head that pops up.
No, it definitely does.
It would fit better if it was like more of like a goofy character in a goofier movie, but here, just especially as like the final Cenobite they have to fight off or whatever, it's a weird like dumb note for like that big elaborate like set piece at the end to end on. But you know what? We've talked a lot about Hellraiser. We have to talk about a whole nother movie. Adam, any final thoughts you can possibly sum up on the original Hellraiser?
I mean, I love it. I love it so much. It got me into Clive Barker. I think I own every book he's written. I've seen every movie that he's attached to. I own a Hellraiser poster signed by most of the principal cast.
Oh, did you meet all of them?
I did. Wow,
Oh, wow.
thanks for asking. Yeah, I didn't talk about that. Hey, Thomas, I met most of the cast from Hellraiser.
Oh my god, I wasn't aware of this information!
I know. How awesome. But once I got into horror, I was always like, and started going to conventions, was like, I got to be Clive Barker. And I got to do it. And it means a lot to me. I absolutely love Clive Barker. I love the man himself. I love his works. And for that, I mean, with all its faults and its sort of, dated effects and all that, it's still a perfect film for me. It is one I watch every year, sometimes several times a year, but definitely in Halloween time, I will watch Hellraiser. I love it.
Yeah, I think it's a great movie in terms of like really building up the mystique about the Cenobites and sort of what their fascination is with that line between pain and pleasure and like melding that so much. I think like that, and also how that really sprinkles off into our various human characters and how they have these various like conflicts with each other about their own desires. With like, we briefly touched on, but like I love so much about like Claire Higgins' Julia character, how much is this weird fascination but animosity with the people around her, that like whether it be like Frank or the various people in her family at the same time, like all these characters have very specific interesting motivations that really drive this plot forward in very bizarre ways that most other horror movies wouldn't do around this time, except for the Cenobites being like as sort of neutral but at the same time very focused on like we have to have some kind of retribution for this box being opened. We need, like, there's a quarter count, like 2 people open this box. We need 2 people to fucking come with us. Like, all that really builds to this, like, really fascinating horror movie that's so unique, especially for the time, and doesn't feel like it could really be replicated despite how many sequels that were made. This one still stands the test of time as, like, the best of these because it's doing certain things that were very new for the time and still aren't often done as much with horror in general, with a lot of the sexual imagery and even some, like, the gorgeous, gory practical effects, all this other stuff. It is very much an original in its own right, down to even something like, we mentioned sort of the score vaguely earlier, but fucking Christopher Young's score in this movie makes up for like sort of the lack of budget. It's like this big, massive operatic score.
Great.
And it all helps build up this big world that Clive Barker's trying to show, despite this taking place mostly in one house and like a couple of times where we move away from it. But it's a great movie. I definitely can see why, it and the lead Cenobite, as it were, became such an iconic staple of horror. But let's get into our next feature, the 4th film in the franchise, Hellraiser Bloodline.
Centuries ago, a toy maker set out to build the perfect puzzle box. A gift that would bring enchantment to all who possessed it. He never dreamed that this simple toy was the key to the gates of hell.
Oh my God.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
Now, centuries later, a scientist has unlocked its secret. And the battle for the future of mankind is about to be fought across the boundaries of time. Welcome to Oblivion. Hellraiser. Bloodline.
So, Hellraiser Bloodline came out March 8th, 1996, from credited director Alan Smithee.
Prolific director at this point.
Though that is the pseudonym, if you're unaware, that is used a lot in especially movies from like the 60s through the 90s for like if a director does not want to have their credited name on the film, because it was directed by Kevin Yeager, who was a special effects guy who did a lot of work, particularly like he designed Chucky in the original Child's Play and also worked on the previous Hellraiser movies. And this is his first normally directorial film, because Hellraiser Bloodline, after Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth, this is the fourth film that had an infamous production, which involved basically Clive Barker originally pitching an idea of like a multi-generational sort of storyline about like the origin of the puzzle box, and then leading into like a story in our modern times of 1996 at that point, and then a story in the future. And they shot it originally in sort of like a chronological order based on a script that had been written based on Clive Barker's story. And that production was already like hellish, had a lot of different issues that were going on. But then at this point, the franchise was owned by Miramax. Yeah, the Weinsteins were not a fan of the film in its form at that point, so they organized for a lot of re-edits and reshoots that were not done by Kevin Yeager. They were done by Joe Chappelle, who had just worked for the Weinsteins on the brilliant horror sequel, Halloween 6.
Oh, chef, yes.
Perfect. Well, it's so great. Yeah, there was a lot of tumultuous stuff where this movie was very heavily re-edited and screwed around with, and bombed horribly. For its $9.3 million budget, only made $4 million, thus confirming that if any more Hellraiser movies were to come out, which they were, in 2000, Hellraiser Inferno came out straight to video, where the franchise has been ever since. And this one has a lot of infamy too, especially with like the sort of Hellraiser in space element, which is like only a third of the movie, but it's still like kind of like the more infamous element of it. But despite that sort of like reputation, a lot of people don't like this movie very much, and I had it as a bad pick. Adam, I believe you're kind of more of a fan of Bloodline, though.
Yeah, I kind of dig it, man. Like, look, but I look at it as a whole. Like, compared to all the other sequels we've gotten, I think Bloodline is one of the best ones. Like, I would put 1, 2 in Bloodline instead of getting to the Cenobite's backstory, which it's one of those things I don't want to know. I like them as the entity they are. But yeah, do I want to see who made the puzzle box and why he made it and all that? Yeah, fuck yeah, I want to see that. Like, I think it's kind of a cool idea that the person who made the Lament configuration, their bloodline is now cursed. And it's going to follow them no matter what, because they made this key to open up into this reality of hell. I think it's kind of cool. Is it silly in a lot of parts? Sure. Is it great? No. But I think it gets unjustly hated. Like, there's no reason. Like, oh, space, and people put this on the line of like Leprechaun in space. Like, no. Or even Jason X. No. I'd put this above any of the other horror movies that went to space. But like you said, it's a third of the movie at best. I think it's actually a pretty cool movie. I love the idea of those aristocrats that have this sort of the box built and they're into black magic and all of that. Adam Scott is super funny. And I like the Cenobite design in this. I love the way the the Princess of Hell looks. I love the twins. The only one I don't like the Chatter dog, but whatever, who cares? But I think this is a pretty solid sequel.
Well, I'll say this, which I agree with you that it's not like necessarily the worst. Even of like the theatrically released movies, I would put this over Hellraiser 3 necessarily. But I think the thing that makes this distinct and notable is I would say it's the most ambitious of any of the Hellraiser sequels, and more crucially, even if you did know any of the like behind the scenes stuff, this is clearly the messiest of these Hellraiser movies as well. Because I think even for like there are worse Hellraiser movies than this, but at the same time, I can give credit to some of those worse Hellraiser movies know what they are and don't feel necessarily as like cobbled together as this one does. I would say. I think there are some that are like obviously like far worse in quality, but this one feels the most like you had such a massive ambition, but there's so much clear like weirdly edited things. Like I agree with you that I like a lot of the stuff about them commissioning the Lament configuration in like 1700s France, but that is so truncated, and that was very much the case where like a lot of the stuff that's on the cutting room floor is from that section, and it feels like so bizarrely small in the movie. Then the stuff that's in the present day, I think is the stuff that like works the most like consistently in terms of like, I feel like there's a beginning and middle end to that particular element of the movie. I think like a lot of the sequences are like the most complete of any sort. And then the space stuff, I think is like, there's some fun moments, but that's the stuff where I can see the most studio meddling. So much like the happy ending and a lot of these sequences where it's like these weird space police raiders that are going around. Like, who the fuck are these guys? What is this? Like, they never explain anything about that, like, at all. Who these fuckers are.
They really, really don't.
No, and it's very much feels like all that stuff feels so much like, oh, we're just trying to rip off aliens in the middle of a Hellraiser movie. It's really bizarre and weird, especially when it's like, it's not even in the middle of a Hellraiser movie. It's in the last, like, 20 minutes of this hour, 25-minute long movie.
Have you peeped the designs for the aristocrat Cenobites?
Well, I've seen some of the work print stuff, where particularly like the Angelique character was like apparently the person who actually commissioned the box.
But there's photos you can find, and it's the Cenobites, and they're dressed in period clothing, even with the wigs and stuff, and their faces are stretched and they're bleeding. Like, it's pretty cool, and I guess all that got cut. It's very sloppy. It's very messy. Although Doug Bradley kind of slays the shit in this movie. Doug Bradley's Pinhead in this might be his best performance since the first one.
Right. I would agree with you that like this is at a point where obviously, like I mentioned, like in Hellraiser 2, they start kind of giving the Cenobites a bit more humanity, which I'm not for necessarily, but I do love the fact that they implement that here with Pinhead, where like Pinhead is so pissed off in this fucking movie about how much like bullshit is going wrong. He's very upset about just like what the fuck's happening. I had a thing, I have a system, and this Angelique lady comes out of fucking nowhere and is starting to like fuck with my shit. Like, this is my shit.
God damn it. Literally and figuratively. But I think that's what works for him. But it's not like an over-the-top anger. Like, it's just through his vocal performance. You're like, he's tired.
He had a shitty day at work, and he's very upset that people are fucking with, like, the system he created for the work, like, for the office. Like, this is supposed to work like this, and you're all fucking with the system I created. I had a whole presentation. Anyone come to the meeting? Anyone get the memo? I guess not.
GPS reports. What the fuck does that mean?
Right, and I like a lot of the scenes. Apparently there was a lot more sequences between him and Angelique, who is the sort of a demonic entity that initially there's like a peasant girl who's in like the 1700s that is possessed by this demon Angelique. But Valentina Vargas, I think, is so fun in this movie, and all the scenes between her and Doug Bradley are really cool.
She's great. But not even that. Even the scenes with her when she's eating, she's doing like the and moaning and stuff. Like, she's camping it up to a level that makes it believable because she's this person in this weird circumstance. And then once she becomes Angelique, and dude, when she shoves her thumb into Adam Scott's face,
yes,
you're like, oh, she's serious. like, oh, shit is popping off. Yeah, I love Angelique, and I love the idea that they do with the practical effects of her crown, the scalp flayed down to show the skull. I mean, it's amazing.
It's a really cool Cenobite design. All the Cenobite designs are really good in this. Down to like you mentioned the twins, who are these two security guards who become like this weird, like mutated version of like conjoined twins who like literally have like a little like fucking thing that's like connecting their heads, like the weird twisted flesh and shit like that. It's so weird, bizarre in the way they killed that one guy by like thruppling and sandwiching him.
Yeah, great. But again, sexual.
Right.
I mean, I'd argue this is probably the last of the movies. Obviously, it's the theatrical one. Well, I don't know, man. Inferno's really sexual too, but I'd argue this was the last one that had like the sort of subtlety with the sexuality in it. The rest kind of shove it in your face.
Subtle is never a word I would ever use to describe any element of this movie.
No. Well, all of these movies are sexual. Like, obvious, we know that. But this one didn't have the nudity. But as you go forward with 5 to wherever the fuck we're at now, the sexuality is so like pushed to the forefront. There's no feeling behind it. It's just, oh, it's sexy, so here's sex. That's why I didn't like part 3. Because part 3 was all sex. I think the thing that works about Hellraiser the most is when the sexuality is always there, but is not necessarily pushed to the forefront.
I guess the difference is like in like the original 2 movies, and I'd say even this one, there's more at least a mind to like the actual like psychology behind sexuality as opposed to like sort of teenage boy sexuality, where it's just like, oh, look, there are boobs. Look,
Boobs.
There are boobs there. Right, yeah, so there feels like there's a bit more in its mind with sort of like the sexuality and like the psychological element of it. I can definitely see that. I think also just another thing with this movie is our main character sort of plays like 3 different versions of the Merchant character through different
and he's
timelines.
terrible.
Bruce Ramsey, yeah, not a good actor. I think he's fine in like the present day stuff, but when he's asked to be Victorian era French, and then also later on like the fucking like, oh, I'm the shaved head, like I'm the only badass space guy who can help you out, those are terrible performances.
Basically, he's in the fountain at that point.
Right, yeah.
No, he's terrible. The present day stuff, like he's okay. But that's the thing. I guess that's kind of what the Hellraiser franchise became, right? Like, you want to see the Cenobites. They didn't put too much stock into the leads or the human characters.
Which is a problem given like the earlier movies had that kind of interest at least in like the human characters that like help build up to the Cenobites versus when you have especially like Pinhead and the Cenobites in like bigger roles. Like Hellraiser 3 is more guilty of this, but this one also has a bit of that. Like you remove a bit of the mystique the more they're on screen, which I feel like is a problem. Like it feels just like, oh, like these mysterious creatures from hell, but like the more we get of them sort of like having the office politics like more directly in our face, the more it's just kind of like, oh, they're not as like mysterious and fun as we thought they were.
Well, when you get 30 minutes of them, you're like, okay, all right, we're good.
But at the same time, I respect the fact that Pinhead doesn't have like an actual role in this movie, as opposed to in various later sequels. Pinhead kind of feels like one of those characters who are like NPCs in a video game that you would run into, where it's
agree.
like, oh look, Pinhead's here, like, and he's like, hey, go over there to this part of the plot. And then,
take this; it will help you on your journey.
Right, that's his pretty much his role. Is like 90% of the last few Hellraiser movies after this.
Oh, absolutely.
As opposed to here, he has more of like an actual role and has a bit more of like a mind to him necessarily.
He feels like an angry dad in this movie.
Right.
Which I like. He's in control, but he's not. He still has to answer to the Hell Priestess, or, the princess, as he calls her. So she's kind of his boss, but like he's just so over it. Like,
but and you also get the sense that given that she's like a demon versus a Cenobite, like you get the sense of like, oh, these are different sects of hell. These are like different creatures, despite the fact they're of hell. And like they're from various different levels.
She was born a demon, whereas Pinhead was somebody who solved the box and became a Cenobite, which I also hate.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that reveal in Hellraiser 2. Yeah, that's the bit where he says, "I remember," is the moment where I feel like, oh, this is a bad turn. This isn't like really work for the rest of these movies.
And you got Chenard going for like 20 minutes.
Well, and also doing puns and shit that like feel very much of like the Freddy Krueger's rejected scraps.
100%.
the doctor is in and shit like that. But to get back to Hellraiser Bloodline, at the same time, yeah, there's interesting elements. Like I do love the scene where they do turn the peasant woman into Angelique, and you have like the one guy with the bouffant sort of giant hair, like setting up all the traps and stuff. And meanwhile, once again, like Adam Scott is like, it's his first movie, and he's going so hard as possible. There's a great like Conan interview where he talks about the fact that he's like, oh, this is like me breaking into the big time. This is gonna be my big thing. We're like, after this, guys, it's fine. Don't worry, I'm still Adam.
But he's actually really good in it. Like I don't think he's terrible. Look, there's been way worse acting in the previous movies and way worse acting in the latter movie.
Right. I don't think that excuses him from necessarily not being like great, but I think he's entertaining in the movie.
Is it because we know it's Adam Scott, which makes it entertaining?
I think that's part of it, but also I've never been huge on Adam Scott in dramatic roles necessarily. I think like anytime he's presented himself as like in a more dramatic sense, it does always feel like, is this a bit? Is this a fucking bit, dude?
Yeah, I get that.
Like down to my favorite bit of him in this movie is in the 90s, where for some reason he's like been able to live for centuries. Another unexplained thing that I don't get.
Yeah,
he's a
whatever. Yeah.
Right, but where he's talking to Angelique and it's just like, oh, can I have permission, Adam Scott, to go off to America? And, nah, fuck America. Stay here. He's got that terrible hair. That long, scraggly, greasy hair.
Yeah, no, it's awful. It's awful.
So funny. And then even when he's getting murdered, it's just like, oh god. He's gonna burst apart.
And she murders the fuck out of him.
With her like very sharp nails, yeah.
And then sucks on the wound.
Right.
Like it's so gross, but again, so sexual in nature. Like, ugh. I love it though. The thing about this movie is, out of all the Hellraiser movies, I can watch Bloodlines more than any of them, because Bloodlines still has sort of the Hellraiser mythos behind it, but it's in a way the least disturbing and the least offensive out of all of them.
I can at least say like the big problem after this movie is that a lot of the straight-to-video movies were infamously scripts that were not originally meant to be Hellraiser movies, that had to be like reworked to include like the Cenobites and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of those do it better than others in terms of integrating the Cenobites and stuff, but this one at least feels like it's one of the few sequels that's like actually trying to build up more of the mythology. In terms of, like you mentioned, like the puzzle box being commissioned as a specific portal to hell by these people and some of this other stuff. I agree that I think like a lot of this on paper, there's a lot of fascinating ideas and an ambition that makes it definitely get high above a lot of the other Hellraiser movies, but still that messiness I think is also kind of frustrating, because unlike a lot of the other like sort of sequels that would happen after this, you feel like there's a better movie in this one, as opposed to like, oh no, there's no saving this even with a big budget. Like something like, Hellraiser Hellworld wouldn't be saved necessarily by a massive budget.
No, I can agree with that. I think the biggest detriment to this film is the space stuff.
Yeah.
If they would have just cut that out and gone from past to modern day, I think this movie would be legit, dude.
Or even have like the sort of space stuff as like more of like a final set piece, as opposed to being like an entire third of the movie necessarily. It basically, stuff from like the 1700s and the stuff from space switched runtimes, basically, in prominence. I think it would be a much better movie.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
Cause there's even in the space stuff, there is some fun things. Like I love the dumb like robot that's being used to solve the Lament configuration.
Yeah, that's a cool idea.
Right, particularly the bit where like the robot looks at the camera after it's solved, like, and then explodes.
Great. I mean, what a cool idea that these things come out and you have them contained. Like how creepy, and you can see it, and then like they do the little girl's voice and all that. Like it's a very creepy and sinister. It's just, I feel this movie wants to go to 10, and I feel they stop at 7.
Which I think obviously is due to a lot of the executive meddling stuff that.
Oh, sure.
Like particularly with the whole ending where Pinhead's like, I can't die, but no, they solve the cube around him.
Yeah, because the sun kills Pinhead. Like, wait a minute, what the fuck is happening here?
I think that's a lot of the stuff, like you mentioned, like sort of the reputation of that and the executive meddling, the Alan Smithy credit, Cenobites go to space element, I think is like what kind of hurts the reputation of this movie necessarily. But at the same time, I think because of its ambition, it has like a lot of fascinating like elements to it. Like even the stuff in the present day where you sort of have like the Cenobites kind of like appearing behind corners and stuff of like the present day era, like particularly how weirdly creepily they're like around Cortland Mead, who plays the son of the present day era, the puzzle maker guy. Credit to also Cortland Mead, most famous probably for a lot of people, where he played Danny Torrance in the Shining miniseries.
Yeah, oh yeah, he did. I don't like that.
And
kid.
he was also in like Little Rascals, and he was the voice of Gus on Recess, which was a show I watched as a kid. Like that kid instantaneously looks like 90s kid. Like if you have like 90s character actor kid, immediately he looks like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a little buck-toothed monster
with a bowl cut.
God, why was that a thing?
and also credit to the mom, horror royalty Kim Myers from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2.
Yeah, basically Dollar Store Meryl Streep.
Right, yes. Even though in this movie she looks more like Dollar Store Annette O'Toole.
Yeah, she really does. Yeah.
Right, she does. But at the same time, she's like doing as much as she can against Bruce Ramsey. Which is like, I'm really concerned about you like getting into your work. Don't worry about it. I'm doing great. Like, which is another problem. Like, there definitely are like sort of like lead character problems in a lot of these Hellraiser sequels. Like, I think that's even a problem with like Inferno, where if that guy wasn't the main character in Inferno, I think that movie would be kind of great, as opposed to that guy is like so bad.
Craig Sheffer?
Yes, the lead of Nightbreed. I'm sorry for insulting Clive Barker acting royalty.
No, he's terrible.
Like that.
He's terrible. He's terrible.
But yeah, do you think sort of if they were to ever construct, I guess, like the original vision of Kevin Yeager with some of like there's like, you know, work print footage and stuff, do you think there is like a truly great Hellraiser movie in this one?
No. I feel there's a perfectly competent Hellraiser movie, but I honestly think, well, because I'm very trepidatious about the new one coming out. It looks great. Like, it looks great. I'm super excited. But if you're not the man who wrote it, the man who did it, like, it's a very hard thing to sort of convey, and then it just becomes horror slasher jump scare garbage.
Well, from what I understand, Clive Barker was actually involved in the new movie as opposed to, like, most of the ones after this one.
I know he was. But still, we'll see. I mean, I have very high hopes for it.
And I mean, nothing else, I'm very curious because it's like David Bruckner doing it, who was the guy that did like The Night House and The Ritual. I think is a very solid horror director.
Yeah, he's all right.
So I think there's like more of a chance for that to work, but we'll see on that. As opposed to, I guess we're not talking that much more about Hellraiser Bloodline. So final thoughts, Adam, on Hellraiser Bloodline.
Out of the theatrical released Hellraiser movies, I would put it at number 2. I'd even put it above Hellbound because the Dr. Chenard stuff is ridiculous. But I think Bloodline gets unjustly shit upon. Like, I think it's fun. I think it's fine. There's things that I would take out of it or change, but I'm not the guy who made it. It exists as it is, and I think it's actually pretty solid.
Yeah, I have more, I guess, mixed feelings clearly on this. I would definitely still say it's like third for me of the theatrical releases, despite my issues with Hellbound. There's still like so many more like fascinating, weird, like divergent, particularly when Kirsty goes into like the weird dimension in Hellbound. There's a lot of like fun, bizarre things like the weird carnival and shit, and the baby who sewed its mouth shut and shit. Like there's still like more interesting, fun imagery, and that would put it, I guess, a bit above Bloodline, because like I said, Bloodline is such a fucking massive mess of a movie that I don't think it can ever quite be, like, solid to me. But I still find it fascinating as, like, a weird object of, once again, like, all the studio meddling and all this stuff. But at the same time, the creative ideas still, like, pop out at you at certain points. There's still, like, fun elements that pop out that still make it a cut above most of the other Hellraiser movies that would follow. But at the same time, I would still say it's still the messiest one out of any of them.
Well, that's where the popcorn pops.
Indeed, indeed. But now, Adam, it's time for our weekly segment, The Double Redo. Double redo.
Double redo.
The double redo. Double redo.
Double redo. Double redo.
That works. So, the Double Redo is a segment we do every week, in which Adam and I talk about a good and a bad feature related to the topic in question, so in this case, Hellraiser. Adam and I each have a good and a bad pick to talk about from this massive franchise. So I'll go ahead and go first with my two choices. For my good, that I would recommend to everybody. I have, as of this recording, the most recent Hellraiser film, and I think one that got a bit unfairly shit upon as well, as we were talking about with Bloodline. I have Hellraiser Judgment, which came out in 2018, the most recent straight-to-video release, that I think a lot of the hate toward it came from a lot of bad will from the previous movie, which we'll be talking about in a moment, from Adam's choices. It's directed by Gary Che Tunnicliffe, who was a guy who had worked in the special effects department for a lot of the earlier movies, and was really trying to like get a version of his sort of like Hellraiser script put out there. And this was in production hell for a bit for that. But he eventually got it made as Hellraiser Judgment, which introduces these new elements of like the Auditor, which basically at the start of this movie, Pinhead's talking to another sort of hellish creature who was like, oh my god, so many people are like being awful and shitty and disturbing like on various different like technological screens at this point in time. I can't handle all this shit. Can you like streamline damnation for me, please? And the Auditor, who's played by the director as well, is such a fun character, and I love like the initially how he's introduced as this guy who's like processing basically like an awful like serial killer pedophile human character, and how he goes through like all these various different like trials and through the system of like, okay, the Auditor asks questions, and then this other guy comes in like basically eats his testimony and then leading into like all this other weird shit that happens along the line. I think all of that like stuff to add like sort of more bureaucracy into Hellraiser is so fascinating. I love how that's all really unleashed. I think there are problems with the movie, particularly with like sort of the main human stories, this kind of like Seven-esque detective story that I'm not the hugest fan of necessarily. I think that's the most perfunctory sort of like procedural cop stuff that makes this not a great movie. But at the same time, the guy who plays like the main sort of detective who they are trying to audit at a certain point, I think is a pretty solid actor against like all these like weird, bizarre elements. And even with like a mystery that I think is weird and perfunctory, I think all the stuff that's like really underneath about like what sort of hell has become and the system of judging people for their damnation is so cool and adds a whole nother layer to the series. Like there's even a bit of heaven introduced into it that's like very new for the franchise, that I think it takes a lot of interesting risks and is a lot better than a lot of the other direct-to-video sequels, because it takes these new interesting turns to like really develop more about like how has hell changed basically over the course of centuries. How does hell work with all the various different new avenues where people can be depraved and awful and shitty. And I find that interesting, and I find it very underrated in terms of the Hellraiser movies. But then my bad is, I would say one of the two Hellraisers, particularly the direct-to-video ones, that I do not like. It is Hellraiser Deader, which this one is, I think, the textbook example where, like I mentioned earlier, so many of these direct-to-video movies were existing scripts that had, like, the Cenobites, like, shoehorned into them. Some, I think, do it better than others. This is one of the worst examples, where it is so clear, like, it's this whole story about, like, a journalist looking up about this cult that can bring people back to life. Basically, they murder somebody and then instantaneously like bring them back to life as she sees like a VHS tape. And it feels so perfunctory to Hellraiser. Like, it's already a bad movie about that subject matter already, that then when like Pinhead and the Cenobites come into it, it feels so perfunctory. It feels like so dull. And it's one of those, once again, where like even if you would have this like a theatrical, bigger budget movie, it would not work. I think it's very dull, very visually bland, just even with its like meager expectations. Like, this is at this point like the second straight-to-video one after Inferno, which I said has some problems, but I think is better than a lot of the other ones. Deader sets a bad precedent for a lot of these other ones to follow. I don't think too many of them are quite as bad as Deader. The title alone is so fucking dumb. The cult is called Deader? What does that fucking mean? This is so awful.
I mean, yeah, dude. I mean, Judgment, I like it in the idea that the new Cenobites or whatever they introduce are very weird. Like, it's so against type of the Cenobites we've ever seen, but they kind of fit in a weird way because it's this new level of hell. Things are changing. Like you said, with the Auditor, I love that character. And I also love the character that comes out of the backpack. You know,
Yes.
where it's so fucking cool. And I love that it's John Gulager, Clu Gulager's son, who directed Feast, is the one who's eating the papers and vomiting them up and everything. Like, very cool, very weird, disturbing. I agree, this sort of tacked on Seven aspect is a little silly. You see it, it's stereotypical, but it's still cool. Like, it works. I think that it's a very competently made film. Deader, oh, God. I mean, it's just a bore fest. Carrie Were, how many of these terrible direct-to-video fucking horror sequels are you going to do? Like, stop. Deader.
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 So spooky. Deader.
Oh, Deader. Sunday. Gravedigger versus Deader. Like, it's so stupid. And it's boring. I've seen it twice, and I'm telling you right now, the only thing I remember is there's a subway scene. It's that forgettable.
One other thing I wanted to shout about Judgment, though,
Sure.
before we continue to your picks. I like the guy who they got to play Pinhead. I think so far, the only two people post Doug Bradley who have played him. I think he's solid, especially because I like in this one, Pinhead basically feels like a guy who like got a promotion for being a Cenobite. And it's just like, oh, now you can do my menial work. We'll create a whole new wing of hell just so you can do shit. And like whenever the auditor comes up like, excuse me, lead Cenobite, can I talk to you? He's like sitting around just like, yeah, well, whatever. Yeah. He's just like he's an executive at this point who's not doing anything.
Yeah, he's okay. I mean, it's hard to fill Doug Bradley's shoes, you know what I mean?
Right, but there's a worse example, which I believe you'll get to with your choices.
Okay, so I'll go with my good first. My good was the 6th of the Hellraiser franchises, Hellraiser Hellseeker, which stars Dean Winters, which everybody knows as like Chaos from the commercials. He's also
excuse me, I believe it's Mayhem, sir.
Mayhem. But he's also in like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He's popped up everywhere.
John Wick as well.
John Wick, right? He's great. Ashley Lawrence is back in this one. It's not great, but it's entertaining. It's kind of a cool twist they do where you know what's going on, but he's spoilers, but where he's in his own personal hell. Like that's kind of a cool idea. Is it carried off to the best it could be? No, but they're working with the budget they did, and I think it's kind of fun. I'm shortening that one because All right, here we go.
Okay.
Hellraiser Revelations, which was part of the Dimension Extreme, because they had to keep the rights, so they put this one out. And the biggest thing I remember about this before I saw it, because their tagline was from the mind of Clive Barker. And Clive Barker came out right after that came out and said, "This isn't from my mind. It's not even born out of my asshole." Why is he that angry? Watch the movie. It is horrible. It is terrible. It does several things I hate, but one of my biggest things I hate in horror movies, where they like make a family name after someone prominent in horror, just so you'd be like, "Oh, I know that name." In this movie, it's the Cravens and the Carpenters, or whatever the fuck. It's terrible. And then there's like an incestual thing that happens. The guy who's playing Pinhead is terrible, and the makeup is awful. The CGI they're trying to do is terrible. I've seen every movie that's come out from all of the main franchises. I'm one of those guys. I love them. I'm a completionist. Bar none, this is bottom of the barrel garbage. It is garbage. It's offensive on every level. Being a Hellraiser fan, a horror movie fan, a film fan, it's garbage. It is a piece of shit. And I hate it. And I hate that I'm talking about it. And I just want to go to bed now.
Hellseeker, to go back to that, I agree that I think that one is definitely the best of the direct-to-video ones. I would say that forms a nice trilogy with Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2, and then Hellseeker is like an actual solid trilogy, obviously because Ashley Lawrence returns in there. But I also do really like you kind of mentioned, like the stuff with Dean Winters. What I like is that they kind of play it like it's almost Memento, where he doesn't really remember what happened earlier. And the whole movie's about him realizing who he actually is and what actually happened ultimately with like his missing wife, who is Kirsty. I like a lot of those elements. I think it does. I agree with its smaller budget. I think it does as much as it can. And that was Rick Boda, I believe, is the director's name, who did 6, 7, and 8, I believe. And it's such a fascinating, weird breath between like that one, Deader, and Hellworld are all such weird, bizarre ways of doing a Hellraiser movie that most of them don't work. But Hellseeker is definitely, I would agree, the best example of that. And Hellraiser Revelation was definitely, when I was going through this was what I feared every one of these direct-to-video sequels would be, in terms of just like there is like such a creative bankruptcy to it. Because even like the basic premise if you're unaware, is that it's like two families are like coming together because like, like our sons who are both friends died or like have been gone missing, and we're both like kind of trying to have a dinner to, sort of emotionally support ourselves. And then one of them shows up randomly. One of the two sons who disappeared from one of the families shows up, and it's so obvious what they're doing with that character. And even like the incestuous thing you're mentioning, it's all like this very weird version of like the original movie that just feels like so like pasted together, because this was the key example of like a franchise rights holder movie, because Hellworld was like 2005, this is 2011, so if Dimension didn't make this movie, they wouldn't be able to keep the Hellraiser rights, and it is so slapped together, it fucking shows. Like, God bless the guy who they got to play Pinhead, not good, but also I feel so bad for him in that puffy ass makeup that makes fucking Pinhead look like he's having a shellfish allergic reaction. The whole movie, I'm just like, give him an EpiPen. For the love of God, give this guy some kind of fucking help.
He had some bad crab ragoons.
Right, he's some kind of food poisoning. God help this, you give him to a hospital. Despite being like only like 75 minutes long, it feels the longest out of any of these. Like all these Hellraiser movies, the longest one of them is like 100 minutes, I think. Like Bloodline, I believe, is 100 minutes long. This one feels at least 10 times as long.
Wait a minute. Revelation's only 75 minutes long?
It's barely a fucking movie.
Oh my God. Like it legitimately feels like a chore to get through.
Like I was watching it on it's available to stream on Tubi. That's how I watched it. Like I was begging for more Tubi commercials. Like no, get Craig Robinson singing about Gain and all these other bullshit commercials like that. I usually like wait until they're done. I want more of that instead of watching the actual movie I'm watching.
Oh.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and repeat our titles for everybody out there. For my good, I had Hellraiser Judgment, and for my bad, I had Hellraiser Deader.
And for my good, I had Hellraiser Hellseeker. And for my bad, I had Hellraiser Revelations. Just don't watch it, guys.
No, don't watch it. Even if you're a completionist, we would not recommend skip past that one, for sure, to go to Judgment, the much better one. The one that I think like suffered because Hellraiser Revelations was so bad, everyone's like, oh, fuck any more Hellraiser movies. And I think Judgment got a bad rap because they had to follow up that bullshit, quite frankly. But we want to, go ahead and start doing our wrap-up, but keep in mind, we'll be doing our picking for next week's episode at the end of this one, so stay tuned. First, though, we gotta thank some people, like Chris Oliver for the intro and outro music used in our show. Listen to more of his music at chrisoliver.bandcamp.com. Thanks to Christian Thorlally for our artwork. Follow him at Night of Water, that's night with a K, _of_water, for more of his great stuff on various socials. And of course, thanks also to our Patreon supporters, patreon.com/DEDBpod, where for just $1 a month, you all get to do stuff like vote in polls for movies and topics we cover, like you all picked Hellraiser Bloodline for us to cover here, so we appreciate that. Right, this week that we're releasing this episode, you all get to pick one of my good choices for next month. We should announce this, Adam. We're doing another theme month after our horror month of October in November. We're going to be doing all repeat topics we've done previously that we want to revisit, and we're calling it Revember. Hold for applause for that great title that I came up with. Thank you. I appreciate it so much. But you all get to pick for one of the episodes we're revisiting something. It's going to be spoof movies. We're coming back to that for the first time in quite a while on the show. You all get to pick between my two good choices on that one, and my two good choices are the Abrams-Zucker underrated follow-up to Airplane, Top Secret, versus Stephen Chow's very silly over-the-top martial arts movie Kung Fu Hustle.
I don't like either.
You don't like either of them?
No.
Oh.
No. But to be fair, I've only seen both of them once, so it could be fun to revisit.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be fascinating. So that's even more of an interest for all of you. Pick which one for Adam to reassess, as it were, between two movies I personally quite enjoy. But you all get to vote for that. And also, stay tuned for on the Patreon. We'll be doing another On the Edge of Relevance for, we've been talking about Hellraiser this whole time. We'll definitely be talking about the Hulu Hellraiser, which is coming out, this Friday as of when we're putting this out. So we'll definitely get together and talk about it.
I cannot fucking wait for that new Hellraiser movie. You have no idea. I'm bursting through my Oshkosh Bagosh right now.
Yeah, and you're just like, oh man, I can't wait to see it. More importantly, meet all the people who were in it at a horror convention.
Yeah, because I'm going to have a sign a poster and I'm going to tell you all about it several times.
Please find it.
Yeah. Gordon Vishnick. Who the fuck are you?
I look forward to all of that on the Patreon for just the $1. But to find more of us, please follow us on Twitter and Facebook at DEDBpod. And you can also submit feedback to us, doubleedgedoublebill@gmail.com, all spelled out. And for more of me, find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at NotTheWho'sTommy. And I also do some writing at marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com.
You can also follow me on Instagram at Atom or Adam. That's ATOM_OR_ADAM. And you can also find me on Letterboxd at Schwanson. That's SCHWANDGSON.
And to hear more of us, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows on the network? And you can also dig into our archives and our Podbean main feed for like 200 episodes since before we joined Talk Film Society. And nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon, we get it, money can be tight. The simple free way to help us out is to rate, review, or share the show around because it gets us more visibility out there and gets us more souls to conquer.
Yeah, we like that. We like that a lot. It's cool.
Yes, it's quite cool. Just like what's very cool is we'll be doing our picking for next week's episode, Adam. So every week, Adam and I each have two choices. One of us is two good choices, one of us is two bad choices, and we assign them between 1 and 10 for each of our choices, which we specify on the quality on for who has good, who has bad. And, one person will pick a number between 1 and 10 and be like, oh, I'm going to pick number 6. And so the opposite person will be like, okay, that's closest to number 7, which has blank movie. And that gets us our good and our bad choice. But keep in mind, we do have the Godfather rule, where Adam and I each still have a veto burning in our back pocket we have to use before our next anniversary in May. Where if we hear either a good or a bad choice that we pick a number for, and we're like, you know what, I don't want to cover that movie. Actually, I'll take the cannoli. So if we say that, that means that choice is null and void. We have to go with whatever other choice is available. And we can only do that once. So, we got to do it before May.
Got to do it.
And we might do it for our next, in our Halloween spooky episode topics. We are going to the world of Blumhouse, which, Jason Blum and Blumhouse, it's been around for, a little over a decade now and has become a huge voice in horror. So we figured it would be fascinating to dip our toes into that, especially now that one of their bigger productions is coming out to coincide with that Halloween Ends. But I have the two good choices for Blumhouse. We have the two bad ones. So, so I'm very curious where this will go. So, Adam, for my two good choices, please pick a number between 1 and 10.
I'll go number 7.
Okay. At number 8, I have a movie that I think is criminally underrated in terms of the Blumhouse movies. It was one of the ones that they sold off to Netflix. It came out and kind of came and went, but I think is one of their better examples in their catalog. I think it's an incredible little horror movie. I have Cam.
Okay. I don't know what that is.
It is a horror movie about a cam girl who ends up getting her identity stolen by a mysterious force.
Oh, all right. Okay. Since I don't know what it is, I'm not going to take the cannoli.
Okay. Well, on the opposite side of things, over at number 3, I have a movie from one of our boys who got his start doing a lot like the Blumhouse movies and has only risen up the horror platform ladder. I have Mike Flanagan's Hush, another one that was on Netflix.
That's a good movie. It's
Yeah.
dope. That's
So
dope.
stay tuned if you're disappointed, folks. You might hear more Mike Flanagan talk on the Patreon.
Oh,
Wink, wink, wink.
You never know.
Well, but Adam, now, bad, there's a lot of ways this could go. I'm very curious where this will go. So, for your bad, I'm gonna pick number 3.
All right. At number 2, I have a movie that came out in 2020 based on an old sitcom. I have Fantasy Island.
Oh, one of the few theatrical releases of 2020.
Mhm.
Interesting. I have not seen Fantasy Island, and I've been kind of morbidly curious. So you know what? I'm not going to take the cannoli on that.
All right. At number 10, I have a movie that we actually watched together that I actually kind of like, but I know a lot of people don't, and it is very flawed. I had Ma.
Oh, Ma. Yes, Ma is very interesting. I wouldn't say I liked it necessarily, but there's a lot of fun to Ma.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes. But so Fantasy Island and Cam. Oh, another weird double feature from us. We'll get to next time. But until then, everybody, you've solved the Lament configuration for now.
Your suffering. Well, probably be legendary. I don't know. It depends.
I don't know about legendary, but it'll be noteworthy.
It depends on what your kinks are.
Right. No kink shaming.
No kink shaming.